Hey guys, how's it going?
Good.
Good? You sound very low energy, Kelsey.
Well, you just say good when someone asks you that question.
Well, I'm genuinely interested. What happened at, I didn't go to the thing on Friday. Who won the faculty award?
Jacksonville.
Okay. How was everybody's Friday?
I don't know. I thought my presentation went pretty well. It's like a practice run through for my final thesis presentation.
Oh, good, good. So you're feeling good about that going into that? I didn't hear any response.
Oh yeah, I nodded. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Sorry. I'm pulling things up on my computer as I go here. So, Kelsey, how did you feel about your presentation?
I thought it went well. I'm glad to be done with it.
Good. All right. Well, there you have it. Did you get my message?
I did.
Yeah. So there's a book written by a Kansas City author whose name I can't remember, but she wrote this book called The River of Doubt, which is about this expedition that Teddy Roosevelt went on to explore this uncharted river in South America called the River of Doubt. And it's an interesting story because one of his sons accompanied him on this trip and died while there, and they just had a really terrible time in terms of staying healthy and lots of people dying. And it's just a pretty fascinating story about the part of the world that your talk was centered on at a time period that is interesting because we don't have that lack of technology that they dealt with back in the day. So anyway, when you graduate and have a spare moment, you might want to pick that up. I thought it was a pretty well written book. And I'm getting lots of buzzing in my ear from email, which I thought I had turned off. Okay. So this is the time of year when it seems like everything is happening. And among the things that are happening is that at the same time that a couple of you guys were presenting your work to the Jewel community, I was gearing up to present some stuff that I've been working on to a broader community. And so I made a presentation on Saturday at the Missouri Academy of Sciences meeting, and it's something that I was going to involve you guys with at one point in time and ended up not doing. So I just wanted to share with you what I did on Saturday, what I presented on Saturday, partly because it has to do with herps, and herps were originally my interest for doing this. But then the other thing, it's just tangentially related to the class in the sense that it is on herps, but then it's also dealing with kind of broader issues of conservation. So I'm going to just spend a little time at the beginning of class here sharing that with you, if you don't mind. And even if you do mind, I'm not really giving you a choice about it. So that is that, as they say. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
Just so you know, I feel your pain when you're asked to present in a virtual setting because the meetings on Saturday were hybrid in nature. So there were some of us there in person, and there were other people logging in from other places, and it actually went pretty smoothly, although it was a little bit odd and peculiar, even odder than this way of teaching. One of the faculty members at the end of the day on Friday sent me an email saying, "Oh, this was great. We should do hybrid colloquium every year." And I'm like, "No, please, no." And they're like, but people from off campus can more easily join us. I'm like, I understand that, but can we not? So anyway, I was interested in COVID-19 on roadkill because back during last March, when everybody went kind of sort of into lockdown, it was nice weather out, and I had been riding my bicycle around, and I noticed how much nicer it was to bike when there wasn't quite so much traffic. And I thought to myself, wow, there's less traffic. I'll bet there's less roadkill. I should start keeping track of this. So I did. So when so Elizabeth Everman, my partner, she drove me down this road very slowly for a lot of Sundays this past year. So one way of thinking about landscapes is landscapes are made up of networks. And here we can see that there is a network of human transportation. If I'm going to go from William Jewell College to Missouri City, I have a variety of routes that I can use to get there, but I can't just move randomly on the landscape because my movements are canalized by the road network that I have to travel on. So I can go down Richfield Road to Missouri City Road to Missouri City, or I can go down H Highway, which is more out of the way, or I can go down 291 to 210. In a similar way, animals might be wanting to move from one habitat to another, and they can use habitat corridors to do this. So for example, if you want to move from this area of forest to this area of forest, you just cross the road, but you could also crawl through a culvert right here, or you could follow this riparian corridor here and go underneath a bridge down here to get from this environment to this environment. And so we have these two networks. One is a human transportation network and one is an animal movement network. And where these two networks intersect, you might see higher incidences of roadkill. So in the literature, these are referred to as vehicle-animal collisions, but you usually hear people referring to vehicle-animal collisions when they're thinking about large animals that cause damage to property, damage to your car. And so there are two types of papers that are out there in the literature. One type of paper refers to these things as vehicle-animal collisions because they're written by people who are mainly interested in things like insurance risk. But then there's another set of papers that are done by people like me where we think of it from the perspective of the animal being killed, and we generally refer to those things as roadkill. And so I'm going to use the term roadkill from now on because I'm not really concerned about damage to people's cars because most of the animals that we're going to be talking about today aren't causing damage to cars. So one of the things that influences the prevalence and distribution of roadkill is the distribution of these intersections of the animal movement network and the human transportation network. But there are other things that also affect this. One is spatial and temporal variation in animal movements. So there's seasonal variation, and there are also these correlations with habitats. Certain habitats might be more prone to have roadkill associated with them than others. But there's also spatial and temporal variation in human movements. So humans move at different times of the day. They move at different days of the week. There's also seasonal variation. More people traveling during the summertime when people are on vacation. More people traveling around holidays. But then we might also see a reduction in vehicle traffic related to pandemic shutdowns. So I went and found some data on the Bureau of Transportation Statistics website, and this essentially shows us the total vehicle miles traveled over the time period from mid-March of 2020 to the end of April of 2021. And you see that in March, there was a huge decrease, a 50% decrease in vehicle miles traveled. And then over time, that slowly crept up until we get to the beginning of July. And we're not back to normal levels, which is represented by this baseline, but we're at about 90% of normal vehicle miles traveled. And it isn't actually until the end of February that we actually cross that line and get to an area where we're actually traveling more miles. And these data are broken down in this panel by average trip distance, trip count, trip duration, and vehicle miles traveled. So the vehicle miles traveled is lower, not because the trips that we're taking are shorter, it's lower because we're actually taking fewer trips. And then you can see these peaks showing seasonality, where these peaks are associated with different holidays: Independence Day weekend, Labor Day weekend, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's. You get these peaks in travel. So this depression in traffic was due mainly to the number of trips taken rather than the length of the trips that are taken. So we're basically, this is the point at which traffic kind of got back to normal. So after a severe decline, there was still a steady, a constant decrease throughout the rest of the year after, once again, the beginning of July, and then we didn't get back to normal until February, the end of February, beginning of March of 2021. So I was interested in whether or not this would have an effect. Unfortunately, I didn't start this until the pandemic had already started, so I didn't do this during 2019, and it would have been nice to have 2019 data to compare it to 2020 data, but I had no idea that a pandemic was coming down the pike. So we should expect fewer instances of roadkill during those time periods, experiencing lower traffic volume. Is there a spatial and temporal pattern to instances of roadkill? Like I said before, we should see some seasonal variation, and we should see this spatial variation correlated with features of the habitat. And then another reason that I was interested in roadkill and have been interested in roadkill for a while is there's also this distribution on the road. You know, where is roadkill occurring? Is it occurring in the driving lanes, or is it occurring on the shoulder? In many years of driving around, I have actually seen people drive out of their way to strike animals that were on the road, people swerving onto shoulders, especially to hit turtles for whatever reason. I don't know why people are fascinated with running over turtles. Maybe you guys have some ideas as to why that would be. But in theory, roadkill should be proportional either to road area, so whichever portion of the road has the most area should have the most roadkill, or it should be found more in those areas where cars are actually driving. And so whichever way you look at it, there should be a predictable proportionality to where roadkill occurs. So what I did was every Sunday morning, I wake up early and I drive Missouri 210 between Riverbend and Richmond. It's about 25.5 miles. I record the species, I record where they're killed, I record the latitude and longitude. I get out and examine the carcass in order to identify it, and I also then remove the carcass from the roadway so that I don't count it again in the future. And some of these carcasses are have what's referred to in the literature as long persistence times. So for example, there were 2 barred owls that were killed near Richmond, and their carcasses were still around and identifiable a couple of months after they were killed. So it's important to remove the carcass from the roadway, and that's always a pleasant activity. And we did this every other Sunday from the 5th of April to the present, and I continue to do them. I will go out again this coming Sunday. And then after the fact, I classified road segments based on the bordering habitat. So when you look at the road, this is Riverbend. Liberty is up here. You go down 291, Riverbend is here. This represents mile 0 all the way to mile 25.5 in Richmond. And then these are categorized. Red is agriculture, blue is aquatic, green is forest, and black is suburban. And so for any given point on the road, I know whether the habitat immediately to the 2 sides of the road is either classified as agriculture, forest, aquatic, or suburban. And I'll be color coding all of the graphs from here on out in this way. So I had to learn some new techniques to analyze data. This is just one of the things that you have to do when you're a biologist, is you are constantly learning new things. So if you don't like learning, you need to change majors now and reconsider your profession. So I learned how to do nearest neighbor analysis using a package in R. What nearest neighbor analysis does is it basically looks at the actual distribution of animals in a geographic sense. And then it takes those animals and randomly distributes them across that geographic space. And it does that random distribution a lot of times. And each time it does that, it calculates the distance between nearest neighbors. And then the nearest neighbor index is the observed nearest neighbor distance divided by the predicted nearest neighbor distance on the basis of a random distribution. And so a nearest neighbor index of 1 represents a random distribution because those 2 numbers are similar. A nearest neighbor index less than 1 represents animals that are aggregated, or in this case, roadkill that is aggregated. And a nearest neighbor number greater than 1 represents overdispersion, animals actually avoiding one another because of something like competition. So I did these analyses on the entire data set, and then I divided the different animals up by taxa: mammals, birds, frogs and toads, snakes, and turtles. and this includes all the vertebrate groups that we looked at. So we did 25 surveys, 670 instances of roadkill. That is an underestimate, as I'll explain a little later. 250 mammals, 92 birds, 232 frogs and toads, 21 snakes, and 75 turtles. And this is what it looks like temporally. You see that there are these big peaks, and these peaks are primarily due to the emergence of frogs from ponds as they go through metamorphosis. And that occurs in June and July. And so that's what these big peaks are. But from the standpoint of pandemic, you would predict that the number of roadkill that you find in April of 2021 would be less than the amount of roadkill that you found in April of 2020. But in reality, that's not the case. I actually saw less roadkill in 2021 than in April of 2020. But this might also be related to the fact that it's been a very, very cold late winter and early spring. You'll notice that there's a lack of sampling here. This was during that severe cold snap back in February when it was very cold. There was also a lot of snow on the road. There was no point in going looking for roadkill when the road was regularly being plowed by snow plows. So we picked things up again in March. So it's too early to say anything about the effect of the pandemic because we have the whole rest of this year to look at as kind of normal traffic compared to last year of reduced traffic. When we look at the occurrences of the different groups, we can see strong seasonality in both frogs and toads, turtles and snakes. This seasonality is expected. These guys are all ectotherms, and so we see that they're not moving around much, and as a result, they don't make up a significant portion of the roadkill during winter. Birds and mammals are homeotherms though, and as such, they are more active during the winter. And so we still see that there's a seasonal signal to the occurrence of roadkill, but it's less pronounced than in the ectotherms. So then is there a spatial pattern? We can look at the road, and animals killed in agricultural sections are coded tan, then green for forest, blue for aquatic environments, and once again, black for suburban areas. But it's difficult to see the data because, for example, these blue dots represent a ton of frogs that were emerging from Cooley Lake where we were 2 weeks ago. And they're all just overlapped here. So what you can do with this is you can divide the road up into half-mile segments. And when you divide the road up into half-mile segments, you can create histograms that represent how many animals were found during that half-mile, in that half-mile segment. And what we see is that for some half-mile segments, there's a mixture of both agricultural land and forest in some cases, agricultural land and pond. And so the color coding refers to the habitat within that half-mile that the animals were found near. And so for all taxa, once again, there's this really big peak, but that really big peak occurs right around the area of Cooley Lake, and that big peak is made up primarily of frogs and both two species of frogs, leopard frogs and bullfrogs. So once again, mile 0 over here, mile 25.5 over here corresponds to mile 0 here and mile 25.5 over here. So all of these graphs will now look the same. The only thing that will change is the taxon that is being plotted and then what the patterns are. And so you can see that mammals are distributed both in forest and agriculture, but they tend to be more pronounced in forest than they are in agricultural areas for the most part. Birds are pretty evenly distributed, but once again, slightly more in forest than in agricultural areas. And then there are a decent number of them that are hanging out around, once again, Cooley Lake, which probably just represents a place where they can get a lot of food. Frogs and toads are very non-randomly distributed in space, which you should expect. They're found around areas where there are aquatic breeding sites. And so there's this strong signal of frogs and toads here at the area around Cooley Lake. Snakes, I was surprised at the few number of snakes that we saw because I normally think of snakes as being fairly common in roadkill. But it could be that I'm also just paying more attention to snakes because when I actually go out and quantitatively sample, it turns out snakes are not nearly as abundant as some of the other groups. And they're also relatively evenly distributed along the roadway. Turtles, not surprisingly, once again, are found concentrated around aquatic environments rather than in forests and in agricultural areas. what these histograms basically tell you is that the nearest neighbor index represents aggregation for all groups except snakes, and that aggregation is highly significant. You can also see that because the expected nearest neighbor distance is always higher than the observed nearest neighbor distance. And so this is just the numerical analysis that demonstrates that those patterns that you saw in the previous slides are actually significant. So these animals do not occur randomly on the road. They occur at particular places because of the aggregation of where the road crosses different types of habitat that are important to these different types of organisms. I was surprised by one group of organisms that I saw. We recovered 3 river otters, and when I mapped them, I was surprised to find that they all occur in agricultural areas. And so that befuddled me because it seems like you should see river otters where they're close to the river. So down here around Cooley Lake, maybe at Missouri City, but certainly not way out here in the forests around Richmond, which are very far from the Missouri River. And so what I did was I went and I zoomed in on these areas a little more closely, and Otter 1 and Otter 2 are actually found in an area where there's agriculture to either side of the road. But one of the things that wasn't picked up in my habitat classification was I didn't classify this as aquatic, in spite of the fact that there's this long pond that goes all along the road here. And so presumably these otters are living associated with these ponds. The other one, the one out near Richmond that seems quite far away from the river, we found it right here on the road. And as it turns out, there's this lake here. This lake is connected by a riparian corridor to this road. And so getting back to this idea at the beginning of what I was talking about, where we have animal movement networks and human transportation networks, and where these two networks intersect with one another, we should expect to see roadkill. Well, this is an aquatic-oriented animal that is found embedded in an agricultural landscape, but the one spot where we found it was where an animal movement corridor, one part of the animal movement network has intersected with the human transportation network at a place where it would be totally appropriate to see an otter. That's the last animal I would have expected to see. So we saw with driving lanes versus shoulders, we saw many more animals on the shoulder, and this was significant for all groups, once again, except the snakes. Now, this requires a bunch of caveats. So when I am on the road looking at roadkill, in most cases, it's clear where the animal was killed because it's still there and all of the signs of its impact are there. Frogs get crushed under the tires. As a result, frogs should be the least biased of all of the groups because they will tend to be crushed underneath the tire, and then they'll be where they were killed when you run into them while you're doing a roadkill survey. Similar thing with turtles. When they get killed, they get squished and all of their body fluids squirt out of them. The only group that is a little difficult to classify are birds, because birds are usually flying across the road. They get struck by a car and they will get pushed off to either side. In one case onto the shoulder, in the other case into the adjacent driving lane. So every time I saw an animal, and if it wasn't apparent that it had been killed where it laid, I would always look around for forensic clues as to where the animal had been killed, if it didn't look like it had been killed where it was actually laying. And so here's a family of possums. And what has happened with this family of possums is that the female was crossing the road with her babies either in tow or probably riding on her back. And when the possum was killed, everybody went flying everywhere, and also probably future traffic probably moved these guys around. But when you look at this family of possums, you see that there are 2 possums located on the line here. There's another possum in the other lane, slightly over the center line. There are a couple of possums here. But one of the things that you can see is you can see this area of blood and guts right here. This represents the area where they were initially struck. And so even though these possums are all distributed everywhere around on the landscape, there's forensic evidence as to where they were originally hit. And in almost all cases, I could definitively identify where an animal had been struck by just basically walking around the road looking for this kind of evidence. In this case, we saw a number of animals that were right on the line, and we had to make the decision between whether we were going to classify these as being in the driving lanes or being in the shoulder. And in the beginning, what I did was I just randomly assigned individuals. So the first animal would be assigned to the driving lane, the second animal would be assigned to the shoulder. That resulted in dividing all those animals evenly between the driving lane and the shoulder. And then in another analysis, I took everybody who was on the line and I put them in the driving lane. Because in theory, most animals should be struck in the driving lane, not on the shoulder. And these data are the result of that analysis. So this is an analysis that was done that basically took any questionable classifications, shoulder versus lane, and put all those questionable ones into the driving lane. And in spite of that, you still see this bias towards animals killed on the shoulder. And what is especially depressing to me as a human being is all of these turtles. And turtles are among the easiest to identify in terms of where they were killed. But we see a lot of turtles being killed on the shoulder, relatively few turtles being killed in the driving lane, which basically means people are going out of their way to kill turtles, which depresses me, especially considering how long it takes turtles to reach maturity and start reproducing. And so this is just depressing. Strangely enough, the distribution of the roadkill among taxa was very non-random also. So among these 250 mammals that we saw, 210 of them were either possums or raccoons. Of the 75 turtles, 70 of them were either the red ear spider or the common snapping turtle. And of this 232 frogs and toads, 220 of them were either the plains leopard frog or bullfrogs. So it's a very non-random distribution of the types of animals that are being killed also. And let me remind you that I said earlier that this number 232 is probably a underestimate, and it's because when we look at this distribution of animals, of these frogs and toads, in July, there was one point in July where there were so many frogs that were killed along this stretch of road next to Cooley Lake that it basically just made a greasy slick along the road, and it was impossible to identify individuals. And my notation for that particular day is that along this stretch of road, there were just too many to count, too numerous to count. Not because I couldn't have spent a lot of time out there in the driving lane counting them, but it was actually impossible to distinguish where one frog began and the next frog ended in this particular stretch. So for frogs and toads, this is an underestimate. And that's also an underestimate that is going to be reflected in these data. There are probably way more frogs and toads in the driving lanes than are recorded here because of that one episode of extreme mortality. So basically, can't really say much about COVID. There is seasonality in that ectotherms were more seasonal than homeotherms. Spatial patterns were very non-random, except in snakes. That might be due to just we didn't have very many snakes to choose from. And then more animals were found on the shoulder than in the driving lanes. And in spite of all of those caveats about things that may bias that data, I suspect that that's actually a real result rather than an artifact of the movement of animals after being struck by cars. So what I did this past year is I gathered data all during this reduced traffic period time. I've also gathered some data during this time period when traffic has kind of gotten back to normal. And my plan is to continue doing this for the remainder of the year so that I can then compare this normal traffic volume year to the reduced traffic volume year. And then I'll be able to say something more about the effect of the pandemic. But I don't have any idea what that answer is going to be. I would just predict there to be more roadkill during higher traffic than during lower traffic. And that was what I've been doing with part of my time this year. And that's what I would have had you guys working on had we been able to do it. A lot of boring hours sitting in a car looking for smelly roadkill. So that is what I did on Sunday, or on Saturday rather. Do you guys have any questions about any of that?
How much longer are you going to do it for? Because I know you said that you were going to do it a little while longer.
At least until next March, so that I have like 2 full years of data.
Cool.
No, not cool. Boring, tedious.
I mean, I think it'll be interesting what results you find. So.
Yeah. So one of the things that this illustrates is something that I think you guys have all learned, that doing research is like 90% boredom and tedium. It's doing the same thing over and over and over again, so that you've done it enough times that you can say something about something.
Mm-hmm.
That's certainly the case here. You know, when I've picked up my 70th Plains leopard frog off the road, I'm tired of picking up dead frogs. I feel the same way about greasy raccoons and greasy possums. Not happy about those. And what's really terrible is when I get back to the car, and depending on the state of decomposition of the animal, the smell kind of clings to you, such that you carry it back with you into the car. And Elizabeth is like, "Can you just like stand outside for a few minutes before you come back into the car?" So yeah, there are negative aspects to this, but you're right. I am interested in what the data say, so I'm prepared to smell bad a little bit for it. Other questions you might have about this? Okay, roadkill has been studied a number of times in the past. A surprising amount of roadkill work has been done in the Amazon region, and people basically find that roadkill is a significant source of mortality for certain groups of organisms. And in Texas, there is a state park called Lost Pine State Park. It's outside of Bastrop, Texas, down in central Texas, and there is a population of toads there, a species of toads that is only found in this Lost Pines region. It's called Bufo or Anaxyrus houstonensis. It's the Houston toad, and they discovered, after the toad was described and it was discovered that it existed in this limited geographic area, they actually found that one of the significant causes of its decline was the fact that where it lives, the habitat where it lives during the year is in one area, and the part of its habitat where it breeds is in this Lost Pine State Park, Bastrop State Park. And they built a new highway that basically cuts along the edge of that state park, such that the highway bisects the two areas where this frog basically has its activity, the place where it lives during the year and the place where it goes to breed, and there's a road that goes right between them. And they discovered through studying the species that mortality of the roads crossing, the toads crossing the road during breeding season was a significant source of mortality for these guys. And so what they did was they put up these really short fences along the roadway. They only stand about this tall, and they're tall enough that a toad can't hop over them or can't climb over them. And what they do is they disrupt the movement of toads across the road, but then they direct the toads to these little culverts. And so when the toad is hopping along, hits the barrier, they then turn to either side and they just hop down the barrier until they can get through, because they know what direction they need to be going, and they're just looking for a break in the fence. And when they get to the culvert, they then crawl under the road through the culvert, and they get to the other side of the road without having to cross the road and getting smashed by cars. And so this is a mitigation method that has been used not only for Houston toads in this particular environment, but you will also see these wildlife crossings, especially up in Canada and in the Pacific Northwest, where they've put big fencing along the highways, and then they've essentially created overpasses that, rather than being paved and a road type overpass, it's actually an overpass that has been constructed to resemble the type of habitat that is on either side of the road at that point. And in this case, the animals they're wanting to move from one side of the highway to the other side of the highway. they run into this fence and they do the same thing. They go along the fence until they come to a break in the fence. And then at that point, they can go over the overpass and they can cross the highway without ever coming into contact with the driving lanes. And so roadkill is a big enough problem in wildlife biology that wildlife biologists have come up with mitigating methods to reduce the incidence of roadkill. And they apply to large mammals as well as smaller things like amphibians and reptiles. The cool thing about something as small as a frog is that they could implement that mitigation technique without having to dig up the road. They just basically tunneled under the road using the same type of tunneling equipment that they use to lay like fiber in your neighborhood without having to tear up the entire neighborhood. And then they just inserted these pipes, and then the frogs can go through those tunnels from one side of the road to the other. So that, as they say, is that. All right. Any other questions about all that? All right. Food and feeding is the next topic on the list of things to talk about. One of the reasons for this is that obviously if you can't find food and can't acquire food, you're not going to survive. And so finding food and acquiring food is one of those environmental challenges that organisms have to figure out. And I've been attempting to structure this class around kind of what are the environmental challenges that are faced by organisms and what are the adaptations that they have evolved in order to cope with these things. And so that general theme is followed here as well. So you'll recall back during, or maybe you won't recall for that matter, back during evolution and ecology, we introduced the last case study, which is a predator-prey case study, by introducing this concept called the predation sequence. Do you guys remember the predation sequence? Anybody? Nope. All right. The predation sequence is just a series of steps that a predatory encounter goes through. And you can think of these steps as having a set of activities that a predator does and a set of adaptations that help them at each of these stages, and a set of activities and adaptations that prey have. And then the phase of the sequence is over here. And the first of these phases is the search phase. And so the first thing that you have to do if you're going to find food is you have to search for food. And there are a set of predator adaptations to help them find food, and a set of prey adaptations that help them avoid being found. And what are some things that might help a predator find food?
Like their senses?
Okay, so any of their senses, sure. So having a good sense of eyesight, a good sense of smell. Whoa, that didn't go the way I was expecting it to. A good sense of smell, good eyesight, et cetera, will help an animal find food. What kinds of adaptations might help an animal avoid being found?
Like cryptic coloring.
So cryptic coloration could help. So you just look like your background, and so you kind of blend in with the background, so it's hard to see that you are prey. Other things that they could do are just spacing themselves out, or just avoiding places where you know that predators are found. And so those are all strategies that you could use. Once you have found something, so visual acuity, good hearing, et cetera, and then crypsis would be a good thing, spacing yourself out. avoiding places where predators are. But once you think you've found something that might be prey, the next thing that you have to do is you have to recognize it as prey. So one of the things about crypsis is in crypsis, if you're a prey item, you can avoid predation through crypsis because you look like something that you're not. You look like a lichen on a bark of a tree, when in actuality, you're a gray tree frog. And so when we look at the color pattern of a gray tree frog, for example, it has this lichen-y sort of pattern on it that helps it blend in when it's hanging out on the trunk of a lichen-covered tree. And so recognizing something, once you found something, recognizing it is important. So if you were at my house and I said, oh, we need to go to the store and get something, I can't find my keys, can you help me find my keys? What would help you find my keys?
Knowing what they look like.
Yeah, knowing what they look like. So I don't know how you store your keys. I have my keys on a Key Smart. It's a little thing that allows you to store your keys, and you can just flip one out and have it handy. And then when you don't need it, it just folds back in, fits nicely in your pocket. It also accommodates your bottle opener so that when you go to the bar, you can open your friends' bottles. Makes you popular with people, even though your personality may preclude that. But if you're not looking for this, you may not recognize this as a key holder. And so another thing that helps you with recognition, if you're a predator, is knowing what the thing is that you're looking for. And so forming a thing called a search image. So search image formation is important in this so that you recognize a prey item when you find it. And so having a search image is useful. Crypsis enters into here because you're looking like some inanimate object that you are not. But what's another way in which prey can avoid being recognized as prey? We talked about this with reference to snakes. In the past.
Is it a specific snake?
Yeah, coral snakes and king snakes exhibit this. There are two species in this thing that I'm thinking of. Coral snake has a red, black, and yellow banded pattern. What do king snakes look like?
Does it have to deal with their coloration showing like warning, aposematic?
Yeah, so in coral snakes, you have snakes that are aposematically colored. And so they're banded and that color pattern kind of stands out. But in king snakes, they also have a color pattern, but the color pattern is generally different. And I'm trying to find the images that I'm looking for here. So here are a bunch of king snakes. And you can see that they are banded red, yellow, and black, or red and black, et cetera, et cetera. And unfortunately, I think the coral snakes are in a different book. And these are a bunch of coral snakes. And so one of the ways, presumably, that milk snakes and king snakes avoid being preyed upon is that they have a superficial resemblance to coral snakes. And so coral snakes are aposematically colored. They have this warning coloration that is then mimicked by the king snakes. And so mimicry is one of the ways in which you can avoid being recognized as prey, because you're recognized as something that you should avoid trying to eat rather than something that you should try and eat. And so mimicry helps. These images are from the venomous reptiles of the Western Hemisphere, which is a very large 2-volume set that I have in my office. So mimicry is important. Once you have recognized that the thing that you're looking at is actually prey, you have to capture it. You have to bring it under your control. And so in this case, what are the kinds of adaptations that a predator might have that will help them capture prey?
Speed, like being fast.
What other things? So you're a cheetah and you've run your antelope down, but now that you have caught up to it, how do you actually gain control over it?
Claws?
Yeah, you have claws, you have teeth, you have what the book that I took this from refers to as weapons of offense. How do you avoid being captured if you're prey? You can also be
Fast?
You can also be fast. So you can also be fast. Instead of having weapons of offense, you can have
Weapons of defense?
weapons of defense. You guys have seen the Texas horned lizard in lab, and we read a paper or talked about a paper back in evolution and ecology that showed that the horn length on horned lizards was actually important in helping them avoid predation by loggerhead shrikes. Turtles have the defensive mechanism of they have a shell that they can pull their body parts into. Remember that the box turtles here in the North America and the United States actually have a plastron that is hinged such that when they pull that plastron, that ventral portion of their body up, it basically seals them off completely from the outside. And so you're basically, as a predator, confronted with this bony shell and nothing but the bony shell. And that all helps you, avoiding becoming captured and proceeding to the next phase. That is basically killing and eating. And this is separate from capture, because simply because you capture something doesn't mean that you can kill it and eat it. Another thing that I forgot to mention here is you can advertise to a predator that you have seen it. This is an interesting thing that we'll talk about in a minute. I don't think I have an image of this though, unfortunately. So just because you capture it doesn't mean that you kill and eat it. In the case of newts that have a toxin that immobilizes a snake that might eat it, Butch Brody, when he was out collecting one day, he collected a Samnophis garter snake in the Pacific Northwest. And when he put it in the bag, it was essentially dead. It looked dead. It felt dead. It was flaccid like a dead snake. And he put it in there in order to take it back to his camp and preserve it and maybe open it up and see what it had eaten recently. And when he got back to camp, he opened up the bag, and in the bag where there was only a garter snake, there was now a garter snake and a rough-skinned newt. So evidently the snake had eaten the newt and then been immobilized by the toxins of the newt. And while the snake was immobilized, the newt then crawled out of the mouth of the the snake and into the pillowcase that the snake had been put in. And so in this case, the animal had been found, had been recognized, had been captured, had been eaten, but was never killed, because snakes typically swallow their prey whole, and in many cases they will swallow their prey alive. And then this newt just crawled out of the belly of the snake, so to speak. And so in this case with the snake, the newt has the ability to secrete toxins, and the snake might have detoxifying ability, or it might just be resistant to the toxin. And then we spent a lot of time talking about this in evolution ecology in the last case study that we covered. So here is the predation sequence: searching for prey, recognizing prey, catching prey, and handling prey, which is killing and eating. So we have adaptations that organisms have to acquire prey, and counter adaptations that prey have to avoid becoming prey.
Oh, you're not sharing your screen.
Oh, I'm not. It says I'm sharing my screen. I will stop sharing and I will share again. Can you see it now?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so we have the 4 phases of the predation sequence. We have the predator adaptations, we have counter adaptations. One of these is signaling to a predator that has been detected. This is a example called stotting, is where this example really comes from. Let me, back in evolution ecology, I have this in that PowerPoint, and I don't have it in. No. Oh, that's my problem. Cancel. Stotting behavior is a behavior that is exhibited by gazelles in Africa, and they basically kind of sprink around on all fours. They're basically hopping with their legs really stiff, and it's a very peculiar behavior because it slows you down. Actually, you're not as fast as if you were just galloping away, but you tend to stop when you have seen a predator. And it does potentially 2 things. It signals to the other individuals in your herd that there's a predator nearby, but it also signals to the predator that it has been spotted. And it's kind of like saying to the predator, nanny, nanny, boo, boo, I see you. Don't even trying to run me down, because I have a big head start on you, and I can see exactly where you are and where you're coming from. So you're not going to get the drop on me, nanny, nanny, boo, boo. I'm going to stot around and signal this to you. And the effect that it has on the predator is the predator just doesn't even pursue that individual, because the predator knows that it's not going to be able to sneak up on it. And chances are that it's not going to be successful in attempting to subdue that organism. Can you see the predation sequence? Okay, so there's also a startle response. And so what a startle response is when you've latched onto an animal, for example, a rabbit. Have any of you guys ever killed a rabbit for food? Elizabeth, you're smiling like.
Well, they scream. It's
Oh
horrible.
my God, they scream, and it is a horrible, blood-curdling scream. So when I was in graduate school, I got a job at a zoo, and I worked in the amphibian and reptile house. And one of the things that we had to do was we had to feed these giant pythons, these reticulated pythons. The largest snake in the world is that species. And ours weren't the largest, but they were well fed, let's just say. And so we fed them full-size, like house rabbit kind of rabbits, and we got them from a rabbit supplier. But you don't want to ever feed an animal a live organism, because you don't want the prey to do any damage to the predator, which is the animal that you have on exhibit. And so when we get these full-size rabbit, we're talking big house rabbit kind of rabbits, pet rabbit kind of rabbits. my task was to take them out behind the reptile house and kill them. And we killed all of our animals using cervical dislocation. And so you basically put a bar over the neck and you pull up on the body, and it separates the vertebra of the neck and kills the animal quickly and humanely. And so the first time that I got a shipment of rabbits, I was told to go out behind the reptile house and cervically dislocate them. And I had never killed a rabbit at that point. And so we had a bar. We had a bar that we used for this. And so they gave me the bar, they gave me the rabbits. I went back to this little yard behind the herp house, and I put the bar over the neck of the rabbit, and immediately the rabbit screamed, because the rabbit knew what was about to happen, instinctively knew that this is not a good situation to be in. It screamed. I was not expecting it, and I let go of the back legs of the rabbit. And now there's a rabbit running around in this enclosed space behind the herp house. About that time, Gordon Henley, who is the zoo director, rounds the corner and sees me running feverishly around this yard. And he can't see the rabbit. The rabbit has crawled under a bush. And he's like, "You let go of the rabbit, didn't you?" I'm like, "Yes," because this thing let out this blood-curdling scream. It's a startle response. It caused me to be startled for a moment, and all the rabbit needed was that second of me loosening my grip on it to then escape. So it had been captured, but it escaped the killing and eating phase of predation because it emitted this noise that startled the predator, in this case, a zookeeper. It didn't put it off forever. I eventually caught the rabbit and fed the rabbit to the snakes, but that's a good example of what a startle response is. So when we think about predation, we can think about any pair of predator-prey species and think about what each of them is doing at any point during the sequence. The sequence goes in a sequence because you can't proceed to the recognition of prey until you search for prey. You can't catch prey until you recognize that as something that you would want to be catching. And so this can be disrupted at any point by the activities of the prey and adaptations of the prey. So have that structure in mind as we think about food and feeding in amphibians and reptiles, because there are certain things that amphibians and reptiles have in common. They are generally not herbivores, so most of them are either carnivores or insectivores. Some of them are herbivores, but it's relatively rare. It occurs in tortoises, it occurs in certain iguanas, but the vast majority of them are not eating plant material, except just inadvertently taking it in while they're eating something else. There's a lot of form and function such that the function of a particular morphological adaptation associated with feeding will relate very tightly to the function of that. And so there's going to be a lot of morphology in this chapter. And then there's a certain amount of behavior involved in finding food and eating. And there's also the ecology of predators and prey, and how knowing something about the ecology of predators and prey helps you understand how amphibians and reptiles are kind of making their way in the world. So here at the beginning, we're going to be talking a lot about morphology. And just like we've talked about the difference between aquatic and terrestrial environments, aquatic and terrestrial environments also affect feeding. In aquatic environments, you capture prey and ingest prey by suction and suspension feeding. And this is exhibited by larval salamanders, adult caecilians, larval frogs, turtles. And basically, it's a process of using essentially negative force to create a space inside, typically the mouth of the organism, that then sucks water in, and that water has the animal, the prey item in it, and that's how you get it in. That's what we refer to as compensatory suction. Inertial suction combines compensatory suction with also the movement of the animal, so that while you're sucking water in, you're also moving towards that incoming water. So you're sucking while also lunging at the prey, and both of these work. So when we look at larval salamanders or larval frogs to a certain degree, what you will see is that there are muscles in the lower part of the buccal cavity that essentially create a space there. When they contract, they expand the cavity that is the oral cavity, the buccal cavity. And when they expand that, they're basically creating negative pressure, so that when they then open their mouth, negative pressure is there. And so the positive pressure from the outside causes the water to rush in. And this happens in all kinds of organisms. Larval salamanders will do this. The mata turtle does this, and the frog tadpoles do this as well as plenty of adult frogs that are aquatic. So I'm going to stop the video recording if I can, so that I can let me do it this way.